So let's spend a little bit of time as an end of this conversation to talk about the 4-drug combinations. You already brought it up. You mentioned the GRIFFIN study, which is RVD with daratumumab versus RVD. That was the first presentation at ASH last year, 2018. Peter Voorhees showed, based on very small numbers, there was superiority, and I think it's been updated for ASCO also this year. And then there was a press release just a few weeks ago showing that the primary endpoint, that's a little bit unusual endpoint, was stringent CR, was reported to be superior. It met the endpoint, and it's reported to be 42% in the 4-drug combination versus the 3-drug combination. We also know there are multiple other studies going on with 4 drugs. With these modern combinations, there is the KRD-DARA study. We have that open at our institution. We also showed that at ASH last year. And it's about to be presented at this coming ASH. And then there are isatuximab, the other monoclonal antibody for CD38 in combination also with these backbones. 4 drugs, is that going to be the new future?
Well, I believe that the addition of a monoclonal antibody on top of what has been the standard, the triple regimen, is likely to become standard simply because they have consistently shown more patients respond. So overall response rate is now closer, consistently over 90%. And the depth of response, when you look at MRD, is consistently better when you added the 4 drugs versus 3 drugs.
Right.
So from that point of view, if you're going to cure patients with myeloma, it should be done upfront. My feeling is, yes, the 4-drug would become the standard of care. Then, as he pointed out, whether this 4-drug versus that 4-drug, one of the proteasome inhibitor may be too expensive, or one of the other drug IMiD could be too expensive. So you can always worry about how the exact cocktail is and which is better, financial toxicity, et cetera. But I think 4-drug will be important.
So if we look at the current duration of the response with the current 3-drug combinations, and then we think of adding a 4th drug, we're talking many years. So to prove that the addition of a 4th drug really translates into a clinically meaningful difference, that's going to take many years to prove that. So then we are back to the MRD, where we can say that with 3 drugs you have, say, 25% MRD, and with 4 drugs maybe you have 35. You say 25, 35, how many months of longer PFS is that? We don't know that at this point. So let's say it's another year of PFS. That sounds pretty good to me.
Yeah.
If it's 2 months, well, if you're that patient who has 2 more months, you would say yes, but the payer may have other opinions about it. So what do you think?
Well, I think it depends on what the strength of the correlation between MRD and PFS and OS is. If you look at breast cancer, there's a very poor correlation between overall response rate, progression-free survival, and ultimately overall survival. So using ORR or even PFS as a proxy is not evidence-based. If you can show evidence in multiple myeloma that there's a strong correlation between MRD negativity and overall survival, I think that's a reasonable proxy to use if you have evidence for that.
So we did a meta-analysis. We did the first meta-analysis in collaboration with the National Library of Medicine back in 2015. We pulled all the studies that have been done for MRD testing and also captured overall and progression-free survival.
Yeah.
And the study showed that the correlation translates into a hazard ratio of about 0.5. So you reduce the risk of progression by 50% if you're MRD negative. There is a second study that was initiated by Celgene, and Dana-Farber worked together with them, and they found very similar. They expanded the two slightly larger study base, show very similar. So we have 2 meta-analyses showing that MRD is highly significantly associated with both progression-free and, in this setting, overall survival. I think.
Does the medical community accept that
Yes.
that's a good proxy and that you don't need PFS or OS?
Oh,
Well,
in this regard.
that's a big question.
No.
Oh, yeah, well, it
actually,
is.
in this regard, we were talking about phase 3 trials. So we talked earlier about KCD, KRD. I don't know what the acronym was. The one presented by the Italian Francesca Gay. So they looked at relapse, and so surprising when we talked about transplant, the patient who got the transplant, those who achieved MRD, when they looked at the relapse or follow-up, patient who had the transplant, there were fewer patients relapse. And so the continuous MRD was more in the transplant arm versus, on the KRD arm alone. There were a greater number of patients were relapsing on the KRD arm, even though they were MRD negative. So people are now doing MRD at multiple treatment points. And most of the time, they said in 70% of the cases, they were able to detect by MRD ahead of time that the patient is going to relapse. So the MRD positivity was also able to tell them when they're going to relapse. So I think I understand your question, and I see your rebuttal for Ola's statements, but the data is now coming because all the clinical trials are monitoring the MRD much more sequentially. The precise question of relationship of MRD to PFS, and when MRD becomes positive, that they are coming out of a remission rather than staying in a smoldering phase. All that will be answered within the next few years, but the answers are coming.
But I think also, I'm sure you would agree that if you look across the board for all the different malignancies, both hematologic and solid tumors, overall survival becomes less possible to use as an endpoint as there are more and more drugs available. Because you can always treat recurrence. So eventually, if you think about it as the alphabet, if you're going to go through the entire alphabet and it's just a matter of which drug or which letter you start with, that's the drug. Of course, that will probably be diluted by adding all the other letters subsequently. So overall survival will probably go away, right?
Mm-hmm. I would agree, especially as you point out, when we're now we have 4 lines of treatment in multiple myeloma and maybe 5.
So MRD and PFS probably most likely will be the new regulatory endpoints, most likely. And that's what the FDA also has declared in their guidance document, that that's kind of where we are heading. We are not yet there, but we are heading there.